The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain filled the air as Daniel sat across from his wife, Evelyn. The dim light of the chandelier above their dining table cast warm shadows across the room, giving an illusion of intimacy that had long since faded. 10 years of marriage had sculpted their lives into something familiar yet distant. Parallel lines never meant to touch again. Daniel took a sip of his wine, savoring its bitter edge, unaware that this night would mark the end of everything he thought he knew. Evelyn, always poised, pushed her plate aside and folded her hands over the table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the wooden surface. He recognized that look, the one she wore before delivering something she knew he wouldn't like. "I've been thinking," she began, tilting her head slightly, her auburn hair falling gracefully over her shoulder. "About us." Daniel set his glass down, his fingers tightening around the stem for just a second before relaxing. "Yeah," he said cautiously, already bracing for whatever was coming. Evelyn exhaled dramatically, as if this were a burden she had carried for too long. "I feel like we've fallen into a routine," she continued. "Like we're just existing. There's no passion anymore. No excitement." He watched her carefully. It wasn't the first time she had complained about this. Lately, she had been bringing it up more and more. How they had become predictable, how things felt stale. He had assumed it was just the usual dissatisfaction that came with time, something they could work on. But there was something in her tone tonight, a smugness beneath the concern. "I think we should open our marriage," she said finally, her voice measured, as if she had rehearsed this 100 times in her head. Daniel blinked. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. "What? You heard me," Evelyn said, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I think it's the best way to bring some excitement back into our lives. We both deserve to experience more. We love each other, but we shouldn't have to limit ourselves." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of uncertainty in her expression. But she only looked confident, certain, as if she had already made up her mind and was simply informing him of her decision rather than asking for his input. And that was when he saw it, that gleam in her eye, that little smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She thought she had already won. Daniel felt something cold settle inside him. She believed she would have the upper hand in this, that he would struggle to find anyone while she would have men lining up for her, that she would be the one in control, setting the rules, deciding when and where and with whom. She was already envisioning herself on dates, flirting, being pursued, feeling desired again. And she was picturing him, waiting at home, too loyal, too predictable to ever really take advantage of this new arrangement. She had already decided how this would go. Daniel could have argued. He could have pointed out the flaws in her reasoning, the selfishness of what she was suggesting. But instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. "Okay," he said, leaning back in his chair. Evelyn faltered for just a second. "Okay. If that's what you want," he said smoothly, reaching for his wine again. "Then let's do it." She blinked, clearly not expecting him to agree so easily. "You're sure?" Daniel nodded, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You're right. Maybe we do need something new." Evelyn studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether he was bluffing. Then, her smile returned, wider now, victorious. "I knew you'd understand," she said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Her fingers were warm, soft, familiar. Daniel didn't pull away. But inside, something was already shifting. Because he wasn't agreeing out of desperation, or curiosity, or even to save their marriage. No, he was agreeing because he wanted her to regret it. She had just opened the door to something she couldn't control. And he intended to walk through it, not as the passive husband she expected him to be, but as a man with a plan. The game had begun, and she had no idea she had already lost. The night air was thick with the scent of grilled meat and laughter as Daniel stepped onto the back patio of Evelyn's parents' house. The family gathered here at least once a month, a long-standing tradition filled with familiar faces, inside jokes, and enough tension to keep things interesting. Tonight, though, things felt different. Evelyn had wasted no time after their conversation. Within hours of their agreement, she had dusted off an old dating profile and was already swiping through potential connections as if she had been waiting for this moment. Daniel had watched in silence as she smirked at her screen, the glow of her phone reflecting in her eager eyes. Now, at the gathering, she was turning up the charm, wearing a tight red dress that hugged her curves, her makeup a little more pronounced, her laughter a little too forced. She wanted attention, and she wanted him to notice. Daniel wasn't blind. He saw the way she leaned in just a little too close to one of her male cousin's friends, how she touched his arm lightly as she laughed at a joke that wasn't even funny. She was testing the waters, checking to see if men would flock to her the way she had imagined. He wasn't angry. If anything, he was amused. He grabbed a beer from the cooler and moved toward the garden when he felt someone step up beside him. Well, she didn't waste any time, did she? Daniel turned his head and found himself face to face with Celeste, Evelyn's twin sister. The resemblance was uncanny, the same striking green eyes, the same full lips. But where Evelyn carried an air of entitlement, Celeste had always been grounded, warm, and effortlessly charming in a way her sister wasn't. Daniel smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. You heard. Celeste arched an eyebrow. Heard her talking about it with her friends. She really thinks she's about to have the time of her life, huh? Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. She does. Celeste studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she grinned. And yet, you're just standing here, calm as ever. That's interesting. Daniel shrugged. Why wouldn't I be? Because she thinks she's got the upper hand. Celeste leaned against the patio railing, swirling the wine in her glass. But I think you know something she doesn't. Daniel met her gaze, noting the flicker of amusement there. Celeste had always been sharp, always able to read between the lines. Maybe, he admitted. Celeste smirked. I knew I always liked you more than her other boyfriends. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. That's not a high bar. She laughed, a rich, genuine sound. True. For a moment, they just stood there, watching the party unfold. Evelyn was still deep in conversation with the guy she was using for attention, her body language open, inviting. It was almost embarrassing how obvious she was. You know she's convinced you're going to struggle with this, Celeste said suddenly, her voice quieter now. That you won't be able to find anyone. That she'll be the one who gets to enjoy all the fun. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. I know. Celeste took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving his face. So, tell me, are you going to prove her wrong? Daniel turned to look at her then, really look at her. There was something in her expression, curiosity, maybe even something else. Something unspoken. That depends, he said, his voice smooth, measured. Are you going to help me? Celeste's lips curved into a knowing smile, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she clinked her glass lightly against his beer bottle and took a slow sip, her eyes gleaming with something almost mischievous. Guess we'll see, won't we? That night, Daniel lay in bed, watching the dim glow of Evelyn's phone screen as she scrolled through her dating app. She was fully engrossed, occasionally pausing to type out a response or giggle softly to herself. She didn't even realize he was watching. She really thought this would be easy, that she would walk away with everything, while he would be left standing in the dust. But what she didn't know, what she would never see coming, was that he had no intention of playing the fool. He turned onto his side, closing his eyes. He could still hear Celeste's voice in his head, still see the way she had smirked at him. There had been something different in the way she looked at him tonight, something he couldn't quite name yet. And he had a feeling it wouldn't be the last time he saw that look. The next morning, Evelyn was already up early, putting extra effort into her appearance before heading out for coffee with a friend. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, drinking his coffee as he watched her from the corner of his eye. You going somewhere? He asked casually. Evelyn didn't even glance at him as she adjusted her earrings. Just meeting Claire for coffee. Daniel nodded, feigning disinterest. Have fun. She hesitated just a second before smirking. Oh, I will. Then, with a flick of her hair, she grabbed her purse and headed out the door. Daniel sat there for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. She really thought she had the upper hand. He was going to enjoy proving her wrong. Daniel had always been a patient man. He had spent years listening to Evelyn's complaints about their marriage, absorbing every passive-aggressive remark, every moment of disdain hidden behind carefully chosen words. But now, as he sat in their home watching her pace around the bedroom, frustrated with her phone in hand, he felt something unfamiliar, satisfaction. It had been a week since Evelyn had first floated the idea of an open marriage, and though she had dived in headfirst, the waters weren't as welcoming as she had imagined. Ugh, she groaned, flopping onto the bed beside him. She held up her phone, scrolling furiously through her dating app. Why are men so stupid? They either send the same boring messages, or they think just because we match, I want to hook up right away. Daniel didn't look up from his book. Huh. Shocking. She shot him a look, but he kept his face neutral. I just thought it would be different, she said, shifting onto her side, her brows furrowed in frustration. I thought there'd be, I don't know, some actual conversation. Maybe even a little effort. Daniel turned a page in his book. Maybe you're not looking in the right places. She huffed, lying back against the pillows. Maybe I was too optimistic about this. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside, he was amused. Evelyn had been so certain that the moment she became available, men would come running. She had built up this idea in her head, this fantasy where she would be the one in control, where she would have all the fun while he waited at home, miserable and alone. Except reality wasn't matching up to her expectations. And Daniel? He wasn't waiting around for scraps. Celeste had texted him again that morning. Celeste, so, how's the experiment going? Daniel, depends. Whose side are you on? Celeste, do I have to pick a side? He smirked at the message, picturing her playful expression. Daniel, you're Evelyn's sister. Celeste, and you're my brother-in-law. Doesn't mean I can't be entertained by all of this. Entertained. That was an interesting word choice. Daniel had known Celeste for just as long as he had known Evelyn. Though they were identical twins, the differences between them had always been stark. Evelyn had always been the one in the spotlight, the one who demanded attention. Celeste, on the other hand, had never seemed interested in competing. She had always been more grounded, more observant. And lately, her observations had been aimed at him. Celeste, want to grab a drink later? Call it brother-in-law bonding. A harmless suggestion. On the surface, at least. Daniel stared at the message for a moment before responding. Daniel, sure. Why not? The bar was dimly lit, a quiet place on the outskirts of town where the music wasn't too loud and the conversations weren't drowned out by drunken shouting. Celeste had chosen the spot, and he had to admit, she had good taste. She was already seated at a booth when he arrived, a glass of whiskey in front of her. She smirked when she saw him. Didn't think you'd actually show. Daniel slid into the seat across from her. You invited me, didn't you? She tilted her head. Yeah, but I wasn't sure if you'd be in the mood to talk. He ordered a drink before settling in. What do you want to talk about? Celeste studied him for a moment before shrugging. Oh, the fact that my sister thought she was about to live her best life and is now realizing dating isn't as glamorous as she assumed. Daniel chuckled. You've been keeping tabs. Of course. She tells me everything. Well, she used to. Celeste swirled the ice in her glass. She doesn't know I'm here with you, by the way. He raised an eyebrow. Should she? Celeste smirked. That depends. Are we doing something wrong? Daniel leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass. Are we? Celeste let out a soft laugh. I guess that's up to interpretation. There was something about the way she was looking at him, an unspoken understanding, a knowing glance that carried more weight than the casual banter between them. He could feel the tension, subtle but present, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum. So Celeste said, breaking the silence, what's your plan? Daniel lifted a brow. Plan. Come on. She leaned forward slightly, her chin resting on her hand. Evelyn expected this to be a one-sided thing. She thought she'd be the one with all the options while you just deal with it. But you're not dealing with it, are you? He studied her, trying to decide how much to say. I'm just letting things play out, he finally said. Celeste grinned. You're watching her fall on her face, aren't you? Daniel took a slow sip of his drink. She wanted this. Celeste tapped a finger against her glass. And what do you want? That was the real question, wasn't it? For so long, Daniel had simply been going through the motions. Marriage, routine, expectation, it had all become one long, predictable cycle. But now, for the first time in years, he felt awake. Aware. In control. And then there was Celeste. She was watching him closely, waiting for his answer. But before he could say anything, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her lips twisting slightly before she flipped it over. Let me guess, Daniel said, nodding toward the phone. Evelyn. Celeste sighed. She's been calling me more. She thinks something is up with you. Daniel smirked. She should be worried about herself. Celeste raised her glass in a mock toast. To that. They clinked their glasses together, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, the weight of something unspoken settling between them. Evelyn had thought she held all the cards. She had no idea the deck was already stacked against her. And Daniel? He wasn't just playing along anymore. He was winning. Daniel woke up to the sound of Evelyn pacing in the bathroom. The light seeped through the crack under the door, and the occasional frustrated sigh confirmed what he already suspected. Things weren't going the way she had envisioned. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, letting the moment stretch. A week ago, she had been so smug, so sure of herself. Now, the cracks were forming. The door swung open, and Evelyn stepped into the bedroom, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was still in her silk robe, her hair loosely pulled back, but her expression was anything but relaxed. Daniel turned his head slightly, watching her. Something wrong. Evelyn scoffed, rolling her eyes. Nothing. Just, people are exhausting. He sat up slowly. People. She huffed, flopping onto the bed beside him. Men. Daniel bit back a smirk. Rough night? Evelyn pulled the blanket over herself, glaring at the ceiling. I went on a date last night. He raised an eyebrow. She hadn't mentioned anything before leaving the house, but he had noticed the effort, her makeup more pronounced, her dress tighter than usual, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway long after she had walked out the door. How'd it go? He asked casually. Evelyn groaned. Terrible. First, he showed up late. Then, all he wanted to talk about was himself. And when the check came, he had the nerve to ask if we were splitting it. Daniel chuckled, unable to help himself. Evelyn shot him a glare. Glad you're enjoying this. He shrugged. You were expecting a different experience? She sat up, grabbing her phone from the nightstand. I don't know what I was expecting, but I thought men would at least try. They act so eager in messages, but in person? Ugh. It's like they're either completely dull or just looking for a one-night stand. Daniel tilted his head. Isn't that what you wanted? Evelyn scoffed. Of course not. I wanted excitement. Chemistry. Something fun but not meaningless. She tossed her phone onto the bed in frustration. God, maybe I was being naive. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You sure you don't want to give it more time? He asked, keeping his tone neutral. Maybe you just a bad luck. Evelyn exhaled, rubbing her temples. Yeah, maybe. But the doubt in her voice was already creeping in. Daniel spent the afternoon at the gym, pushing himself harder than usual, enjoying the clarity that came with physical exhaustion. When he stepped outside, his phone buzzed. Celeste, busy. He wiped the sweat from his brow before responding. Daniel, just finished up at the gym. What's up? Celeste, thought you might need some entertainment. Want to grab coffee? A few weeks ago, he might have hesitated. But now? Daniel, where? She sent him a location, a small cafe downtown. It was quieter than the spots Evelyn usually picked, more personal, less performative. By the time he arrived, Celeste was already seated, a cup of coffee in front of her, scrolling through her phone with an amused expression. He slid into the seat across from her. What's so funny? Celeste glanced up, her eyes shining with mischief. Oh, just Evelyn's little meltdown last night. Daniel raised an eyebrow. She called you. Celeste smirked, taking a sip of her drink. Of course. She was fuming. Apparently, her amazing date turned out to be a self-absorbed loser who made her pay for half of dinner. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. And she was expecting. Celeste shrugged. For the world to bend to her expectations, as usual. Daniel chuckled. Sounds about right. Celeste tilted her head, studying him. You're handling this a lot better than I thought you would. He raised an eyebrow. You expected me to fall apart? She smirked. Not fall apart, but maybe sulk a little. Play the hurt husband role. Daniel shook his head. Evelyn assumed she'd be the only one benefiting from this. She thought she'd be out there having the time of her life while I sat at home, waiting for her to come back. Celeste's smile grew. And instead, he met her gaze, a slow smirk forming. Instead, she's realizing she's not as desirable as she thought. And I'm realizing I never needed her approval in the first place. Celeste's fingers tapped lightly against her coffee cup. Interesting. Daniel took a sip of his drink. What? Celeste shrugged. I think you're enjoying this more than you're letting on. He didn't deny it. Later that evening, Evelyn was getting ready to go out again. She was trying to act casual, but Daniel could see the strain in her movements, the forced confidence, the way she kept checking her reflection in the mirror, fixing and refixing her hair. You sure about this? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. Evelyn glanced at him through the mirror. Why wouldn't I be? You didn't sound too thrilled about last night. She scoffed, turning to face him. So what? I had one bad date. Doesn't mean I'm giving up. He nodded, pushing off the doorframe. Well, good luck. Evelyn watched him for a moment before narrowing her eyes. You seem unbothered by all of this. Daniel smirked. Should I be bothered? Her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know. I just figured you'd have more questions. Or something. He shrugged. You wanted this, remember? Evelyn hesitated, but then her phone buzzed. A message. Her expression lit up for a second before she quickly turned away, grabbing her purse. Don't wait up. Daniel didn't respond. He just watched her walk out the door. And for the first time in a long time, he felt nothing but freedom. Later that night, as he sat on the couch, his phone buzzed again. Celeste, want to hear something funny? Daniel, always. Celeste, Evelyn's new date just messaged me on a dating app. He has no idea we're sisters. Daniel barked out a laugh, shaking his head. Daniel, you going to tell her? Celeste, hell no. Let's see how this plays out. Daniel grinned, running a hand through his hair. Evelyn had no idea how much control she had already lost. And Daniel? He was just getting started. Daniel wasn't sure when the shift had happened. Maybe it had been gradual, sneaking up on him in the moments between laughter and shared glances. Or maybe it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. But now, sitting in Celeste's dimly lit apartment, he could no longer pretend that it was just harmless conversation. He hadn't planned for this. Or maybe he had. The air between them was thick with something unsaid, something neither of them dared to voice but both of them felt. Celeste sat across from him, one leg tucked beneath her, a wine glass resting in her hand. The television played softly in the background, but neither of them was paying attention. You know, she mused, swirling the wine in her glass, I think Evelyn really believed she was going to get everything she wanted out of this. Daniel smirked, taking a sip of his own drink. And now? Celeste leaned forward slightly, her green eyes gleaming with amusement. Now? She's realizing that dating isn't as easy as she thought. She's frustrated, confused, and maybe even a little jealous. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Jealous? Celeste nodded, setting her glass down on the coffee table. She doesn't know why, but she feels it. She wanted to be the one in control, the one dictating how this played out. But instead, you're not reacting the way she expected. And that bothers her. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. She thought I'd be struggling. Celeste smirked. And yet, here you are. Here he was, sitting in her apartment, drinking wine, feeling something shift in the air between them. Celeste tilted her head, studying him. Tell me something, Daniel. Have you even gone on a date? He hesitated for a moment before answering. No. Her lips curled into a knowing smile. Interesting. Daniel leaned back against the couch, watching her. Why do you ask? Because, she said, taking another sip of her wine, it tells me that this isn't about you wanting to meet other people. She met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. It's about proving a point. He didn't deny it. Celeste exhaled, shaking her head. I should be mad at you. You know, you're my sister's husband. Daniel's smirk faltered slightly. And yet, you're not. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him. Then, finally, she let out a soft laugh. No, I'm not. Something about that admission sent a spark through him. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just the weight of the moment, pressing down on them, daring them to acknowledge what was already there. Daniel set his drink down, the glass clinking softly against the table. Celeste. She didn't move away, didn't break eye contact. And then, before he could think better of it, before he could stop himself, he leaned in. Their lips met, soft at first, testing the boundaries of something unspoken. Celeste inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as she pulled him closer. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It wasn't careful. It was a collision of everything they had been ignoring, everything they had left unsaid. Daniel's hand found the curve of her waist, fingers pressing into warm skin beneath the hem of her sweater. Celeste sighed into him, her body melting against his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It didn't matter that this was wrong. It didn't matter that this would change everything. The only thing that mattered was the way she felt against him, the way her lips moved with his, the way her breath hitched when his fingers traced along the small of her back. But then, as quickly as it started, Celeste pulled away. She stared at him, lips parted, breath uneven. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she whispered, that was a bad idea. Daniel swallowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. I know. Celeste let out a shaky breath, running a hand through her hair. We shouldn't have. But neither of them moved. Neither of them stepped away. Instead, they just sat there, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them like an undeniable truth. Finally, Celeste exhaled, shaking her head. Evelyn can never know. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze still locked onto hers. She won't. It wasn't just a promise. It was a warning. Because now, the game had changed. And neither of them could pretend otherwise. Daniel had always prided himself on his ability to keep a straight face, to maintain control over his emotions no matter the situation. But as he sat across from Evelyn at the breakfast table, watching her absent-mindedly scroll through her phone while sipping coffee, he felt the weight of his own secret pressing against his chest. It had been 3 days since he kissed Celeste. 3 days since the invisible line between them had been crossed. And now, nothing felt the same. Evelyn barely glanced at him, her focus entirely on her phone, likely sifting through more disappointing messages from her lackluster dating adventures. Daniel, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about Celeste. Her lips, the way her body had melted against his, the way she had whispered that it was a mistake but hadn't moved away. He had spent the last few nights lying awake, replaying the moment over and over again, wondering what would happen next. He didn't have to wonder for long. His phone buzzed beside him on the table. He glanced at the screen. "Celeste, I need to see you." A simple message, but it sent a rush of adrenaline through him nonetheless. He glanced at Evelyn, but she was still too absorbed in her phone to notice anything. He typed out a quick response. "Daniel, where?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Celeste, same place." Daniel clenched his jaw, resisting the smirk that threatened to form. 2 hours later, he was at Celeste's apartment. She opened the door before he could even knock, pulling him inside quickly before shutting it behind him. He barely had time to take in her appearance, her hair slightly tousled, her lips parted, before she grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him into a desperate kiss. Daniel responded instantly, his hands finding her waist, pressing her against the door as his lips moved against hers. There was no hesitation this time. No uncertainty. Just heat, raw and undeniable. She gasped softly when his fingers tangled in her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss. "We shouldn't be doing this," she murmured, even as she clung to him. "I know," he muttered against her lips. Neither of them stopped. Their bodies fit together like something inevitable, something long overdue. Every kiss, every touch only fueled the fire that had been building between them. And in that moment, Daniel wasn't thinking about Evelyn. He was only thinking about Celeste. Hours later, as he drove home, his mind was a mess of tangled thoughts. He knew what he was doing was dangerous, reckless, but he couldn't bring himself to feel guilty. Evelyn had wanted an open marriage. Now she had it. She just didn't realize that she wasn't the one in control anymore. Evelyn sat on the couch when he got home, her legs curled beneath her, her phone resting in her lap. "You're out a lot lately," she said without looking up. Daniel paused, shrugging off his jacket. "Work's been busy," she hummed in response, tapping her fingers against her knee. "You've been really calm about everything." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Should I be otherwise?" Evelyn studied him then, her gaze sharp, calculating. "I don't know. You haven't asked me anything about my dates. You haven't seemed jealous. It's almost like you don't care." He smirked. "I don't." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not normal." Daniel shrugged, walking toward the kitchen. "Maybe I've just accepted things for what they are." Evelyn watched him for a long moment, as if searching for something. But whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. Instead, she just sighed, rubbing her temples. "This isn't how I thought things would go." Daniel poured himself a drink. "No." She shook her head. "No. I thought it would be different." He took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch between them. "Maybe," he said finally, "you didn't think it through." Evelyn scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Right. Because you're suddenly an expert on relationships." Daniel smirked but said nothing. She sighed again, slumping back into the couch. "I don't know. Maybe I just haven't found the right person yet." "Maybe," Daniel echoed, his fingers tightening around his glass. Evelyn exhaled, grabbing her phone and scrolling mindlessly again. She was distracted, frustrated, lost in her own failure. And she had no idea that Daniel was already winning. Celeste's calls became more frequent after that. Sometimes, it was just to talk. Other times, it was more. But each time, the lines between them blurred even further. Daniel knew it was dangerous. He knew it was reckless. But he didn't stop. And neither did she. Then, one evening, Evelyn sat at the dinner table, absently pushing her food around her plate, her expression unreadable. "You've been distant lately," she said without looking up. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Have I?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like you're detached. Like you don't even care what I do anymore." Daniel smirked, setting his fork down. "Maybe I don't." Evelyn flinched slightly, but she covered it quickly. "That's not how this is supposed to go." Daniel leaned back in his chair, tilting his head. "How is it supposed to go, Evelyn?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know. I just..." I thought we'd both be experiencing things. I thought. You thought you'd be the one having all the fun while I sat here waiting for you? Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Daniel shook his head, standing up. You wanted this. Now you have it. Evelyn watched him as he walked away, something unreadable in her expression. For the first time, it seemed like she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake. And Daniel? He had never felt more certain of his choices. Daniel had always known that secrets had a way of unraveling, no matter how carefully they were kept. He had been careful, methodical, never leaving anything to chance. But as he stood in the shower, letting the hot water wash over him, he felt an unease settle deep in his bones. Something was off. He hadn't seen Evelyn all evening. She had been unusually quiet the night before, her usual passive-aggressive remarks replaced by silence. That wasn't like her. Evelyn was many things, but quiet wasn't one of them. As he turned off the water and reached for a towel, a noise from the bedroom made him pause. The soft shuffle of movement, the creak of the bed shifting, then silence. Daniel took his time drying off, his mind racing through the possibilities. When he finally stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, he saw her. Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the bed, his phone in her hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Then Evelyn slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. Her expression wasn't one of anger. It wasn't even one of shock. It was something worse. It was quiet devastation. Daniel clenched his jaw, his mind already working through the worst-case scenarios. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice measured, controlled. Evelyn exhaled, holding up the phone. "You left this unlocked." His stomach tightened. "So you went through it?" Her lips twitched, a humorless smile forming. "Of course I did." Daniel didn't move, didn't react. He simply waited. Evelyn looked down at the phone again, her fingers gripping it tightly. "At first, I was just curious. You've been acting strange lately, so I thought maybe you were finally, I don't know, seeing someone." She let out a breathless laugh. "Turns out, I was right. Just not in the way I expected." Daniel's pulse remained steady, but his mind was moving fast. There was no point in denying it. She wouldn't be sitting here like this if she hadn't seen everything. "Still," he asked, "what exactly did you see?" Evelyn scoffed, shaking her head. "Don't play dumb, Daniel. I saw the messages. I saw everything." She lifted the phone again, scrolling briefly before tossing it onto the bed between them. It landed face up, the screen still glowing with Celeste's name at the top of the message thread. Daniel didn't bother looking. He already knew what was there. Evelyn's breathing was shallow, her shoulders stiff. "My sister," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Of all the people, Daniel, my twin." Daniel slowly sat down in the chair across from the bed, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her face. "You know, when I suggested the open marriage, I thought I was the one making the bold move. I thought I'd be the one in control." She looked at him then, her green eyes burning with something raw and unfamiliar. "I never thought you'd do this." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. "You thought I'd sit back and let you have all the fun?" Evelyn flinched slightly, as if the words physically struck her. "This isn't fun, Daniel. This is betrayal." He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "Is it?" Her eyes widened. "You're really going to act like this isn't the worst thing you could have done to me?" Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You opened the door, Evelyn. You told me you wanted to see other people. You encouraged it. Now, because it didn't turn out the way you expected, you're suddenly the victim?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I didn't think you'd go behind my back with Celeste." Daniel shrugged. "You never said there were rules." She let out a strangled laugh, running her hands through her hair. "Jesus Christ, Daniel, do you even hear yourself? You didn't just sleep with someone else. You slept with my sister." Silence. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "And?" Evelyn stared at him, her mouth slightly open, disbelief etched across her face. "You really don't feel guilty, do you?" Daniel tilted his head, considering. "Should I?" Her lips trembled for a second before she clenched her jaw. "I hate you," she whispered. He didn't respond. Evelyn stood abruptly, snatching the phone off the bed and gripping it tightly in her fist. "I can't even look at you right now." She stormed past him, her breath uneven, her body tense. The bedroom door slammed shut behind her, shaking the walls. Daniel remained seated, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. He should have felt something. Regret. Guilt. Remorse. But all he felt was relief. The house was silent for the next few hours. Evelyn didn't return to the bedroom. Daniel remained exactly where he was, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. He wasn't sure what her next move would be. Would she leave? Would she confront Celeste? Would she try to pretend this never happened? His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Celeste, she knows, doesn't she? Daniel exhaled through his nose. Daniel, yeah. A long pause. Then, Celeste, what now? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he just stared at the screen, the words blurring together. What now? Now, everything changed. And there was no going back. Daniel sat in the living room, the weight of silence pressing down on him like a thick fog. Evelyn hadn't spoken to him since last night. Not a word, not a glance, not even the passive-aggressive sigh she was known for when she wanted attention. She had slept in the guest room. Or at least, he assumed she had. He hadn't checked. Now, morning light filtered through the curtains, painting long shadows across the floor. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him as he waited. For what? He wasn't sure. Footsteps. He didn't turn as Evelyn entered the room, her presence announced by the rustle of fabric and the subtle scent of her perfume, lighter than usual, almost hesitant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he expected. I'm leaving. Daniel set his mug down, exhaling through his nose. Slowly, he turned to face her. Evelyn stood near the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. She looked different, less composed, less sure of herself. There were dark circles under her eyes, her posture slightly slumped, as if she had spent the entire night fighting a battle inside her head. He met her gaze. Where are you going? She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve. Away from here. I need space. Daniel nodded, as if he had been expecting this. In a way, he had. Evelyn let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You're not even going to try to stop me, are you? He tilted his head slightly, studying her. Do you want me to? She hesitated. For a fraction of a second, she looked like she didn't know the answer. But then her expression hardened, her walls coming back up. No, she said firmly. Daniel nodded again. Then I won't. Evelyn exhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath. God, I hate you for making this so easy. He didn't respond. Because the truth was, it was easy. The moment she had suggested opening their marriage, the foundation of everything they had built had begun to crack. She had thought she was granting them both freedom, but in reality, she had been handing him an escape. And now, she was finally realizing it. Evelyn ran a hand through her hair, sighing. I don't even know what to say to Celeste. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of her sister's name. He had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made the reality of it sharper. Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. My own twin, Daniel? Seriously. He met her gaze evenly. I didn't plan for it to happen. She scoffed. That's the worst part. Because I believe you. A pause. Then, softer, almost a whisper. Did you ever love me? Daniel inhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. Yes. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected the answer. But not anymore, she said, more statement than question. Daniel didn't look away. No. She clenched her jaw, nodding slowly. At least you're honest. She turned then, walking toward the bedroom, and he listened as she began gathering her things. The sound of drawers opening, zippers being pulled, fabric rustling. It felt final. And it was. Celeste called an hour later. How bad is it? She asked without preamble. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face. She's leaving. Celeste was quiet for a long moment. For good. He leaned against the counter, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee he had abandoned earlier. I think so. Celeste exhaled. I should talk to her. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I don't think she wants that right now. I know, Celeste admitted. But she's my sister, Daniel. I can't just pretend like none of this happened. He understood. And yet, something in him bristled at the thought of Evelyn getting inside Celeste's head, poisoning whatever this thing between them had become. Celeste seemed to sense his hesitation. I'm not saying I regret what happened, she clarified. But I do need to face her. If I don't, it'll just make everything worse. Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Do what you have to do. Celeste hesitated. And you? Daniel exhaled, glancing toward the doorway where Evelyn had disappeared minutes before. I think this was always where we were headed. Celeste didn't respond right away. Then, finally, I'll call you later. The line went dead. By afternoon, Evelyn was packed. She stood by the front door, her suitcase beside her, her expression unreadable. Daniel watched her, his hands in his pockets. "This is really it, then?" he asked. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't stay here." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words. She glanced around the house. The home they had built together, the memories they had shared. For a fleeting second, something flickered in her expression. But it was gone just as quickly. Without another word, she reached for the handle of her suitcase and stepped outside. Daniel didn't follow. He didn't try to stop her. Because the truth was he felt nothing at all. That night, Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sheets felt colder, the house quieter. But it wasn't loneliness he felt. It was freedom. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, already knowing who it was. "Celeste, is she gone?" "Daniel, yeah." A pause. Then, "Celeste, are you okay?" Daniel stared at the message for a long moment before typing his response. "Daniel, I don't feel anything." Another pause. Then, "Celeste, come over." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Then, without hesitation, he got up, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. Because Evelyn was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel was exactly where he wanted to be. Daniel had always been good at compartmentalizing. It was a skill that had served him well throughout his life, whether in work, in marriage, or now, in the wreckage of what his life had become. But there were some things that even he couldn't push into a box and ignore. Evelyn was gone, and the fallout had begun. Celeste sat across from him at the small cafe where they had first started this dangerous dance. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her usual smirk replaced by something quieter. "My parents are furious," she said finally, glancing up at him. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "I figured. My dad wants to talk to you." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Of course he does." Celeste tilted her head. "You sure you're ready for that?" He smirked, though there was little humor behind it. "Would it matter if I wasn't?" Celeste studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Nope." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of everything between them settling like an unseen force. "She's not speaking to me," Celeste said softly, breaking the quiet. Daniel met her gaze. "Evelyn?" Celeste nodded, tapping her fingernail against the rim of her coffee cup. "I called." She didn't answer. "I texted." "Nothing." She exhaled, shaking her head. "She's cut me off completely." Daniel wasn't surprised. Evelyn was many things, but forgiving wasn't one of them. She had never been the type to let go of betrayal, especially not one of this magnitude. "She'll come around," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Celeste let out a dry laugh. "No, she won't." She looked up then, something sharp in her expression. "We did this, Daniel. We made this choice." Daniel held her gaze. "Are you regretting it?" Celeste hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. "No," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean I don't feel the weight of it." Daniel nodded, understanding. It was always going to end like this. Celeste sighed. "Yeah, I guess it was." Later that evening, Daniel sat across from Evelyn's father in the dimly lit bar he had chosen for the inevitable confrontation. The older man was composed, but Daniel could see the barely restrained anger in his clenched jaw, the way his fingers gripped the glass a little too tightly. "You've got some nerve," he said finally, his voice calm but laced with steel. Daniel didn't flinch. "I know." Evelyn's father exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You were my son-in-law for 10 years. Daniel met his gaze evenly. "I know that, too." The older man studied him for a long moment before leaning forward. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Daniel nodded. "Go ahead." "Was it worth it?" Daniel didn't look away. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Evelyn's father exhaled sharply, as if he had expected the answer but hated hearing it aloud. "You know," the older man said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I should hate you. I should want to break your damn face for what you did to my daughter." Daniel remained silent. "But what pisses me off the most," he continued, "is that I can't even say she didn't bring this on herself." Daniel blinked, caught slightly off guard. Evelyn's father let out a humorless laugh. "She always wanted control. Always thought she was the smartest person in the room. And now? She's learning the hard way that life doesn't work like that." He downed the rest of his drink before setting the glass down with a dull thud. "But that doesn't change the fact that you hurt her. And you sure as hell hurt Celeste." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I never meant to hurt Celeste." The older man tilted his head. "No? Then what exactly do you think this is?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "It's real." Evelyn's father narrowed his eyes. Then don't ruin her, too. The warning hung heavy between them. Daniel nodded. I won't. The older man studied him for another long moment before pushing back his chair. For your sake, I hope that's true. He left without another word. Daniel remained seated, staring at the empty glass in front of him, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Celeste was waiting for him when he got back to her apartment. She opened the door without a word, stepping aside to let him in. You talked to him, she said after a moment. Daniel nodded, running a hand through his hair. Yeah. She crossed her arms. What did he say? Daniel smirked faintly. Told me not to ruin you. Celeste let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Sounds like him. She hesitated then, biting her lip. And, what did you say? Daniel met her gaze. I told him I wouldn't. Celeste studied him, searching his face for something. Do you mean it? Daniel stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Yeah, I do. Celeste exhaled slowly, something unspoken passing between them. Then I guess we see where this goes. Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. Yeah, he murmured. I guess we do. She didn't pull away. She leaned in. And just like that, the consequences didn't matter anymore. The first thing Daniel noticed was how different the silence felt. When Evelyn had still been in the house, silence had been suffocating, filled with unspoken words and the weight of something inevitable. But now, as he lay in Celeste's bed, the morning sun streaming through the curtains, the quiet was peaceful. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't waiting for something to break. Celeste stirred beside him, her bare shoulder peeking out from beneath the sheets. Her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her breathing slow and steady. Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, watching her, the realization settling deeper in his bones. This was real. It wasn't an act of defiance. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't some twisted game. Celeste shifted, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked a few times before a slow smile curled at her lips. You're staring, she murmured. Daniel smirked. I know. Celeste let out a soft laugh, stretching before rolling onto her side to face him. You always wake up this early? Old habits. She studied him, her expression unreadable for a moment. How do you feel? Daniel considered the question. He had spent so much time analyzing his emotions, trying to understand what he wanted, what he was supposed to do next. But in this moment, as he lay here with Celeste, the answer was simple. Free, he said. Celeste exhaled, a flicker of something relief, maybe passing over her face. Good. She reached up, tracing a fingertip along his jawline. So, what now? Daniel caught her hand, pressing a kiss against her palm. Whatever we want. Her smile widened, but there was still something hesitant in her eyes. You do realize we're not going to get a warm reception, right? Daniel chuckled. Understatement of the year. Celeste sighed, shifting onto her back to stare at the ceiling. My parents are already furious. Evelyn isn't speaking to me. Half her friends are probably taking sides. Daniel leaned in, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. Do you regret it? Celeste turned her head, meeting his gaze. No. And just like that, everything else faded away. Over the next few days, the backlash began. Evelyn had made sure to control the narrative before Daniel or Celeste even had the chance to say a word. People who had once been neutral suddenly weren't. Friends who had known Daniel for years gave him wary glances, hesitant in their interactions. At work, the tension was less direct, but still present. Colleagues whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. Even people who had nothing to do with his personal life seemed to look at him differently. And then there were the messages. Celeste had warned him that Evelyn wouldn't go quietly. But even he hadn't expected the full extent of her bitterness. His phone buzzed for the 100th time that morning. Another long, furious text from Evelyn. Evelyn, I hope you know you're a joke to everyone. No one respects you. No one is on your side. You threw away a marriage for what? Some twisted little fantasy with my sister? You're pathetic, Daniel. And I hope she realizes it soon enough. Daniel sighed, tossing the phone onto his desk. Celeste had told him to ignore it. She wants a reaction, she had said. Don't give her one. And he didn't. Because what was the point? Evelyn had already lost. That evening, Daniel and Celeste sat at the bar of a quiet restaurant, away from prying eyes. It was their first real night out together. Just the two of them, no secrets, no hiding. Celeste swirled her wine glass, watching him. You think people will ever get over it? Daniel shrugged. People love drama. Eventually, they'll find something else to talk about. Celeste smirked. You sound confident. I am. She arched an eyebrow. Even with everything stacked against us? Daniel leaned in, resting his arm on the bar. Nothing is stacked against us. Celeste studied him for a moment, then smiled. I like that answer. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. Good. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of conversation around them fading into the background. Then Celeste took a deep breath. Evelyn's never going to forgive us. Daniel exhaled through his nose. I know. Celeste tilted her head. And you're okay with that? He met her gaze, unwavering. Are you? She hesitated, just for a second, then nodded. Yeah. Daniel squeezed her hand. Then that's all that matters. Celeste let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. God, we're terrible people, aren't we? Daniel smirked. Probably. She rolled her eyes, but didn't let go of his hand. And that was enough. Later that night, as they lay tangled together in bed, Celeste traced absent-minded circles against his chest. Do you think she regrets it? She asked softly. Daniel knew who she meant. Evelyn. The woman who had set this entire chain of events into motion. The woman who had been so sure of herself, so convinced that she held all the power. Did she regret it now? Daniel thought about it for a moment before answering. Yeah, he murmured. I think she does. Celeste exhaled. Good. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then, softly, almost teasingly, Celeste said, You know, technically, she got what she wanted. Daniel smirked. How do you figure? Celeste propped herself up on one elbow, grinning down at him. She wanted excitement. She wanted something new. Something different. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And Celeste leaned in, her lips brushing against his. She just didn't realize you'd be the one finding it. Daniel chuckled, flipping her onto her back. Guess that makes me the winner, then. Celeste laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. Yeah, I guess it does. And as Daniel kissed her, as he pulled her closer, he realized something. Evelyn had thought she was setting herself free, but in the end, he was the one who had truly escaped.